Okay, so good morning, everyone. So,
Morning, sir.
so today is our online consultation and discussion with our subject, web development. And to start with our topic, I'm going to project the PowerPoint presentation in your screen. Hello, good morning sa chat box. So I'm going to present the PowerPoint presentation. Please confirm if the presentation is now present in your screen. Nakikita na po ba yung presentation? Okay. So, welcome to our discussion. So, this is Introduction to PHP. So, this covers the week 1 to 2 of our module. Ano po? So, after our discussion, you can ask your clarification or questions regarding the activities and some concerns with regards to the topic presented. So, let's begin. Okay, PHP. So, by the way, our objective for today is all about I'm going to present and define what PHP is, and we are going to identify some what you call this application of PHP. We are going to differentiate the uh, web application in contrast with Windows applications or so-called Windows application. We also identify the syntax and the variables, data types. So yun. Okay, so learning PHP will allow you to create the functionality uh, required for building real web applications, link handling, storing, and displaying user input. So nowadays, we are very familiar with the use of web browsers, and majority of what we are seeing in our web browsers are what we call web applications. So web applications are actually files that are stored on a web server, which is we access our uh, records, data coming from a database. Ano po. So we call that dynamic websites. So dynamic websites are actually flexible and uh, more accurately described as applications than merely a site. So we can call this an application, web applications. So what is a web application? It's respond to different parameters. So as you can see, just like what we usually do in when we access the social networking sites like Facebooks or the online sites like Lazada or Shopee, uh, when we access the site, we have a different view of the data. So the view of user number one might be different from the view or the screen that is actually viewing by user number two. So it responds to what the user requested. So we have different information that is being displayed on our screen depending on what we requested. So that is what we call dynamic websites. So it allows us to have a memory for user registration, login, e-commerce, and similar processes. So it normally involves HTML forms so that we can input our data and transfer our data to different pages or store them into our database. And it provides us feedback and so forth. So oftentimes, it has interfaces where administrator or user can manage content, and sometimes we call that content management systems. So, dynamic websites are easier to maintain, upgrade, or build upon. So, it's because dynamic websites has the ability to manage content and retrieve information depending on the user needs. We have two types of pages. We have static. That's what HTML pages is all about. Static means that is, when we say static, that is a permanent data wherein if you want to update, all you have to do is go to the source code and modify them. While dynamic, it responds to what the user requested. So that is dynamic website. Okay. Okay. Is my presentation present in your screen right now? Nakikita pa ba? Hello? Hello?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Okay. Thank you for confirming. Okay, so what is PHP? Actually, a PHP is actually originally stood for personal homepage because during that time in early 90s, the first introduction of uh, web was introduced by Tim Berners-Lee with the form of HTML or hypertext markup language. During that time, the only way that we can do to our content is to display it online with static pages. So we called it personal homepage. So after that, Rasmus Lerdorf in 1994 developed this what we call PHP. So the primary reasons why Lerdorf introduced PHP is to track visitors from his online resume. So when the technology evolved, it now become PHP Hypertext Preprocessor. So it's a programming language that allows web developers to create dynamic content that allows user to interact with different applications like databases, services. So it's actually basically used to for developing web-based software applications. During that time, PHP is merely used for developing websites rather than what we call applications. No, websites basically produce information that are stored on database. But right now, we harness that technology to produce what we call web applications. We develop systems that can be viewed online using a web browser. So PHP is an open source. By the way, PHP is scripting language, no, that is stored on what we call web server. So PHP is open source. You can actually look for its documentation on www.php.net. Okay, so there are several things that you can found on that online documentation, starting from the syntax and the other implementation. So I suggest to visit that documentation if you want to find out more about the language. Okay. Now, aside from that, PHP is an embedded code. When it's embedded code, we actually embed the language into HTML since the browser only understands HTML. So we actually borrow the HTML and CSS implementation and embed our PHP code to make the page dynamic. So that's why in your early uh, subject, we used to learn what HTML and CSS is all about, and we learn to use Bootstrap to implement uh, graphical user interface design so that we can have much easier implementation of that particular uh, language. No, so it's important that you have a background on HTML and CSS so that we can display our page in a manner that is being uh, what we call that pleasing to the eyes of the users. No, so PHP is a scripting language that we can implement logic into our web pages. So that's the purpose of that. Uh, Aside from that, PHP is a multi-operating system language, meaning you can use PHP in other operating systems such as Linux, Mac, something like that. So it's multi-platform. Unlike Visual Studio, we can only implement that on Windows, but in PHP, it's like a multi-platform environment language. Aside from that, you might also ask, why PHP? Uh, since PHP is open source, it is being widely used by different developers. And one example of application is the social networking site Facebook. So the Facebook use PHP as their primary language for social networking site like Facebook. No? There are also available languages that we can use for dynamic pages, such as the Microsoft also developed the ESP.NET or active server pages. The Oracle also use Java to develop or to provide Java server pages for web pages, but uh, we use PHP since it has widely acceptable or acceptance to web development, and also aside from its open source, it's actually very familiar to to learn because it based on C or C++. So also it has compatibility with databases such as MySQL. So yeah. Please let me check the Google Meet. May nag-join kasi. Okay. Now let me continue. Okay, by the way, PHP applications. So PHP performs system functions. So like, for example, from files on a system, it can create, open, or read, write, and close files. No? PHP can handle forms like gathering data from files, save data from file, or through email. You can send data, return data to the user. So it has a capability to accept information from the form and or from the user and store it into a database. You can add, edit, delete, or modify elements within your database through PHP. So yeah. It also has cookies, variables, and set cookies. When you say cookies, these are uh, files that you can store on your browser. So let's say, for example, if you try to log in your in your Facebook accounts, and you don't want to, well, let's say, for example, you want to use it again for another time, you don't have to log in anymore since it allows us to store our credential on our browsers. That's what we call cookies. Uh, Using PHP, you can restrict user to access some pages. So since our page allows us to dynamically generate page, it can also allow us to specify which content that we would like to display depending on the type of user that access your page. So just like in Facebook, we can only access data depending on the type of user, like uh, a certain user like friends, we can only access information, while the user account can only owner account can access all the data, such as creating posts, writing comments, etc., and so on. PHP allows us also to encrypt our data. So those are some applications of PHP that you can find, but also there are several applications that you can find online. Just look for them and Google it. So there are several things. Okay, so let us differentiate the difference between Windows application and web-based application. Windows application is a computer-based application that mostly run through operating system, just like what we do in Visual Studio. So in C Sharp, we develop application that runs on Windows applications or run on operating systems such as Windows. So we can integrate several components and so on, and it requires us to compile and install them on a local PC. Okay, so that's the Windows application. While web applications, these are applications that use web browser as a client. So therefore, we have uh, 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 user that use the client computer like the browser. What is the advantage and disadvantage of these two? They, they have there are several advantages and advantages uh, between these two. No? In Windows application, it's actually easier to develop application because some languages like Visual Basic or C# has built-in IDE that allows you to integrate components, while in web application, you need to manually write code to display windows or to display buttons, to integrate design, etc. But there are advantages and uh, disadvantages that you can uh, uh, find depending on your use. No, so uh, anyway, it's depend on what application and the client needs uh, that you can integrate on your application. So okay, a web server. So since we were dealing with dynamic pages, we will be using a web server. So a web server is stores and delivers the content of websites such as text, images, video, application, data to clients that request it. So basically, when we use PHP, we need to implement or use a web server so that we can display or uh, communicate with user's browser depending on what the user data needs. For example, unlike Windows applications such as C# or Visual Basic, it already has a compiler that allows us to compile our program and run it into a local machine, while deploying a Windows or a web application requires us to store them on a web server so that it can interpret what the client requested. So for example, in our diagram here, we have a web browser that requests for a particular data, so the PHP file will be interpreted inside a web server. So as you can see, one of the requirements that our course required is to install the Apache web server. So as you notice in your first activity is that when you develop PHP uh, file, it requires us to store it into a particular location in which our web server resides, and the web server interprets our file. Okay, so when the request is being uh, pushed by the user, so the web server allows us to interpret that request and run our PHP file, and we can allow our PHP file to get information coming from our database and display it into the user screen in the user's web browser. So that's how uh, PHP and web browser interact with the user. Okay. If you have questions, so later we will be discuss what your concerns are. So okay, so you can integrate, you can run your web applications locally. So this one is we can run our websites online in the cloud, but the requirements are it needs to have a web server running, and of course, if you require database or PHP interpreter. No, but locally we can develop your web application using the following tools. So first, we need to have our Apache as our web server. If you need to have a database, we can use MySQL, and of course, the PHP interpreter. Before, in during that time that web applications are being introduced, you need to install these three separately. But right now, since we have this new improvement on developing web application, we have this XAMPP. So this is actually an application that allows us to install those three requirements at one in one software. So XAMPP for Windows allows us to run or deploy Apache web server, and MySQL and PHP interpreter. By the way, in PHP, we need to run the PHP file using a PHP interpreter. So unlike the what we call programming languages such as C++, they require compiler, right? So you need to compile them so that we can identify if there are syntax error or not, or if your code follows the syntax rules that is being uh, integrated into that language. While in PHP, you need to save that into a location, and you need to let the Apache interpret that using the PHP itself. Okay. Okay. What are the things that we can use as our IDE? Unlike C Sharp or other programming languages such as C Sharp, we have Visual Studio, and for C++, we have DevC. In PHP, we only have text editor because since PHP doesn't require us to compile, so we need to input our source code directly to our text editor. So I recommend these three uh, IDE or text editor, the Notepad++, which is one of the simplest form of text editor because it allows us to identify and highlights with color coding mechanism the syntaxes and the lines that we write into our text editor or into the notepad itself. We can distinguish if the code is for C++ or for HTML. Another is VS Code. One of the advantage of using VS Code is the IntelliSense. When you write the character that it pertains to a keyword, it automatically pop-ups the preceding lines that suggest that it suggests lines that you need to uh, type. No. VS Code is the same with Sublime. So I personally recommend to use VS Code. But in our module, I instructed to use Notepad since some of you might be using the old computers. So this software has hardware requirements that you need to follow to for us to be able to use them. So, but if you can install VS Code, I strongly suggest to use it para mas, you can easily identify if our lines has syntax errors and so on. Because when you run PHP, you cannot just uh, uh, we cannot just identify if the only way we can identify that our PHP code has syntax error is to run it on Apache web server. So we have parse error, something like that. Maybe we can uh, try that later. Okay, so how to write
Excuse
PHP?
me, sir.
Yes, yes.
May ma-join pa daw po, sir.
Okay,
Dela Cruz po.
so let me accept them.
Apa.
Masyado kasi silang late kaya ano. Anyway, if we have scheduled time, please come on time so that uh, uh, we couldn't have any delays and just something like this, nag-interrupt tayo. So, if I schedule a specific time, please come early. Anyway, let me continue. So, how do we, first, before we write PHP, how do we create file first? So, first, you need to open your text editor. So, let me open my text editor. So, I will be using the VS Code. So, this is my text editor. Okay. The first thing you need to do is to create your folder for your web page or web application. So I prefer to use the location prescribed by our web server. So this is now the XAMPP. So in order to run our PHP file or code, we need to run the Apache web server. So the Apache web server directly contact PHP interpreter to interpret PHP codes. Okay, so I'm going to click the explore button so that it will directly open the location for my web pages. So it opens the XAMPP directory. So where do we need to store our file? So the only location that we need to store our file is the htdocs folder. So you need to create your own folder there. For example, I will be using the creating a new folder. For example, let's say my saan na ba yan? New folder. Okay. My website, something like that. So after doing that, in your VS Code, you need to load that folder. Okay, so open folder so that you can manage the files inside into your VS Code text editor or IDE. So let me browse the folder. So the XAMPP directory. So locate the XAMPP directory and look for htdocs. And again, do not save PHP file in other places or other location because it will not be interpreted by your web server. The only location that you need to save your file is inside the htdocs folder under XAMPP directory. Now, so this is my folder now. So let me create a file. So let me name this as uh, first page, something like that, dot php. Okay, something like that. So that the VS Code already recognizes that my file is a PHP file. So okay, so let me add some. By the way, as I mentioned a while ago, PHP uh, should be saved with the .php extension name, not HTML. Okay, so let me add some HTML here to properly display the. Okay, so this is what I really like about IDE like VS Code because it allows us to generate automatically some lines that we need without typing the entire markup. Okay, so that's the IntelliSense part of the document. So I'm just putting some needed tag. Okay, so title. In some cases, there are also components that you can or plugins that you can install so that you can generate this markup automatically. Okay, first page. Okay, and body. Okay, now, so how do we put PHP? Okay, so in this case, let's start by providing simple line. So H1. Okay, my first PHP document. Okay, something like that. Okay, so how do we run PHP document? Unlike HTML, we don't normally double click this one to run or to display it in a browser because this will not be interpreted properly. So the only way that we can run our application is to open a browser. For example, I will be opening a blank Firefox document, a browser window, just like this one, and I'm going to write localhost. Local, meaning I will be running the web server. So localhost. When you run the localhost, it will redirect you to the dashboard of the XAMPP application or XAMPP dashboard. So we need to change this, the dashboard, we need to change this. Nakikita po ba? We need to change this with your folder name. For example, in my htdocs folder, I have the directory or folder name, my website. So therefore, in order for me to run my file, I have to change the dashboard to my website. Meaning, I'm going to open the folder of my file. So this one is now your PHP page and you can directly click them. So this is now your PHP. document. Now, let's start by identifying how to embed our PHP. So how to write the PHP? PHP code can be embedded within HTML. Using special PHP tag, you can write instructions. So this is now your PHP uh, tag in order to embed a PHP code. So the code written in this special tag will be replaced by HTML when the page loads. So for example, in this particular example, we embed this PHP line. So when it is interpreted, it will become like this one. How is that possible? So because we embed a programming logic into our page, when it is interpreted by the browser, it will become HTML. So let's try. Okay, so let's try. Let's say for example, PHP can be inserted anywhere of this document. You can insert them at the top, the middle, etc. So depending on your purpose. So let's say we try to add PHP, something like that. So close them. Don't forget to close because PHP doesn't recognize HTML. So if you don't close them properly, it will produce an error because PHP is not recognizing HTML as part of the syntax or rules. So it will become an error. So what will happen if we encounter an error? So let us try to render that into our page. So what an error looks like? An error looks like this one. It's what we call parse error. Parse error means your page is not properly interpreted and it has a syntax error, something like this one. So expecting. Okay. So let's try to close them. Okay, so let's try displaying a message. Hello, echo. Let's say, for example, I want to display a message. How do you display a message? You can put double quotes or single quotes. Let's say I want to display it in a paragraph. Hi, welcome to my page, something like that. Okay, why do we add HTML markup to properly embed our content or this string to properly integrate that into our browser? We need to use the paragraph tag. Okay, I think you all know already what a paragraph tag means, right? So that's all. Okay, so I have some syntax error here. Okay, echo. So let's try to. Okay, okay, let's try to run that. Okay. So as you can see, I have now my content. Now let us try to display the source document. So page, view page source. So as you can see, my PHP is now interpreted as HTML. Okay, so going back to my discussion a while ago, PHP is an embedded language, meaning you embed your PHP code or logic into HTML markup language to properly place your statement or content into your web browser. Something like this one. Gets na po? Clear? Understand na po? Hello? I guess, okay na.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you very much for the response. Okay, so that's how PHP is interpreted. Okay, so uh, as I mentioned, you can put PHP anywhere in your document. Like for example, you can put your PHP in above the document, something like this one. Let's say for example, make sure you properly write the PHP markup, something like this. Okay, or you can write your PHP something like this as short method, something like that. But I strongly suggest to use the method like this way. Okay, let's say for example, I have a data here. So let's say for example, or title. So later I will going to discuss what this is all about. So let's say example, hello, something like that. Okay. Okay, so this statement is a variable that contains string hello. So let's embed that into our page. So in programming language, this is what we call assignment statement, and this is how we display our data to a particular location of our page. Okay, we use echo or we use print. Later, I'm going to differentiate the difference between these two. It's either you put parentheses or it's okay not to put parentheses on print. Say title. By the way, PHP is case sensitive, meaning when you use a variable like this one, uh, case sensitivity means capital letters are different from small letters. Okay, so let's try. So let's save that. Okay, and let's try to refresh the page. Okay, as you can see, I have now hello page, first page hello. So it's embedded in the title of the page. So let us refresh the source code. Okay, nandiyan na siya. So as you notice, parang wala ng PHP. So ang advantage kasi ng PHP is that when it renders to your HTML or in your browser, you will never going to see your PHP code in it. Unlike JavaScript, JavaScript is a client-side scripting language. Whatever statement you put in your JavaScript, it will display in your user's browser. So your PHP is actually hidden into user screen when it is already interpreted by the server. Okay, so let us continue. Okay, so let us continue. Let me Okay, syntax. A statement in PHP is any expression that followed by semicolon. It's like C++ that every statement must be terminated by semicolon. A comment is the portion of a program that exists only for human reader and stripped out before displaying the program's result. So it's like a programming languages that allows us to put documentation into our program. It's really important that we put comments so that we can provide direction to the reader of our program or reader of our code. Okay? So always terminate with semicolon. Okay. Echo and print are more or less the same. They are both used to output data on the screen. So there is no difference between them. You can use either echo or print. Okay? Okay, you notice that when we used to display strings, we use either single quote like this one or double quote like this one. Diba? So what's the difference between those two? There is a difference between strings written in single quote and double quotes. In double quoted string, any variables are expanded to their values, meaning when you use double quote and you add the variable inside the double quote, the display the it outputs the value of that variable into your screen, while in single quote it only produces what is being placed in that particular quotation. For example, let me demonstrate that. I'm going to discuss variable later. Okay, so for example, if we have two variables, okay, let's say we try to print, let's say, let's have some variable, let's say var, let's say 10. By the way, in PHP, you can write your variables multi-line or just single line as long as it terminates by single quote, semicolon rather. Okay, so let us print or display the value of this variable. Let me, okay, so what's the difference between echo and print? So, single quote and double quote rather. Let's say, for example, let's produce a paragraph, another paragraph. Let us use single quote first. P. Okay. Okay, so if you use single quote and you write the var, it will actually display. This is what I like in VS Code because it gives us idea if we have syntax error. So as you can see, we have syntax error here because the line above is not properly terminated. So now I have an hint. Now, let's go back. So I want to display the contents of this line. What will happen if I add variable name to that particular line of echo? So let us try. So save first. Now, as you can see, when I echoed the variable, it literally echoed the variable name. While if you use double quotes, just like what I have said a while ago, it actually prints. So as you can see, the color of the variable is different from the contents of the single quote a while ago. So let us try, which means you're actually displaying the contents of the variable. So that's the difference between double quote and single quote. And aside from that, you might be using something like this one. If you are familiar with form, a form is a component or element in HTML that allows us to uh, add data and transfer that to another page, something like that. So let's say, for example, input type, let's say text. I'm going to display a text. Uh, let's say size, let's say, for example, let's say 15. So I'm going to display a text box in my page. Okay, so this is now my text box. So what if you need to print or echo this particular line? So how are you going to do that? Let's say, for example, there is an instances that you need to display this one, depending on a particular condition. So how do we properly display it or place it into our PHP code? So let's say echo. As you notice, it already contains double quote. So I suggest to use single quote. Why? If you use double quotes, it creates conflict with the existing quotation mark. For example, your PHP might interpret these quotes as end quote of the first quotation mark. So which means this one is a syntax error because it doesn't allows us to provide a line that doesn't properly terminated or not following the syntax error of PHP. So I suggest if you have lines that contains double quotes, use single line from the beginning and the end of that particular statements to properly display this particular line. So let us try. Okay, so we don't encounter any errors yet. So as you can see, it displays with quotation mark because this one is very important in forms, especially in text box, to put the type into double quotations. So to avoid confusion, you need to properly identify when to use single quote and when to use the double quotation mark. Understand? I hope so. So if you have concerns or clarification, so questions kayo later. Okay? So let us continue. Again, double quotation, string, any variable names are expanded to their values, meaning dinidisplay niya yung laman ng value. While single quoted string, no value or no variable expansion takes place. Okay? So I guess it's clear. Okay, what's our variable? It's common to programming languages that we use data. So when we use data, we need to have an storage for it so that we can transform it or we can perform any process to it. So that's the purpose of the variable. In PHP, variable starts with a dollar sign, followed by the name of the variable. I think you already have the idea, the rules of naming variables, right? So I don't have to uh, discuss it anymore. So variable, unlike other languages like C++ or Visual C Sharp, in PHP we don't declare them. Instead, we write them with a preceding value. Since we don't compile PHP, we don't need to declare them anymore, just like this one. If you want to use a variable, then create one and assign a value to it. Let's say, for example, txt, we use this line for number or numeric, so it doesn't requires us to declare. You might ask, sir, what happened if we try to use a particular data type? In other languages, we declare variable because we want that variable to specifically contain a specific type of data. What happened to PHP? Automatically, PHP already figure out what type of data this variable will contain depending on the value that you assign. For example, this one, x, which means the value of this variable will become integer, while this one is a floating point because it contains decimal point. It automatically figure out what particular value this particular variable will contain, okay, depending on the value assigned to it. So let's say, for example, okay, let's say var, uh, let's display this. Okay, let me remove other contents here. Okay, so let's try this one. Uh, let's say var dump. Var dump means you try to display the value of the variable at the same time you want to display its type. Let's say var, something like that, semicolon. Okay, okay, so let me retrieve. So this one, your x variable is an integer type that has a value of 10, something like that. Okay, that's what you call var dump. Let's say, for example, 10.5. Let's see what happened to it. What will happen? Okay. Syntax error. Let's see, for example, what happened? Semicolon. I forgot the semicolon. Sorry. Okay, so as you can see, I have a floating point value 10.5. So PHP already figured out what type your variable will hold. Okay, so let's proceed. Uh, Constant. You can also declare constant in PHP. Constants are like variable except that once they are declared or defined, they cannot be changed or undefined, which means you cannot change any value of the constant variable. So how do we do that? You use the word define followed by the name of the variable constant. I strongly suggest that when you create a constant variable, you make a variable name capital letters or uppercase to simply identify that you're using a constant variable to distinguish the normal variable rather to a constant variable. And aside from that, when you use the define method, you simply write two argument. Number one is the name of the variable and the value you assign to it, a constant value that you assign to it. Okay, so please remember that. And unlike ordinary variable, constant variable doesn't require dollar sign. So when you call them, you just call the constant variable name, just like this one. Okay? So I hope clear siya. Good thing about PHP is that when you create a variable just like this one, you can easily call them anywhere on your document just below it. For example, if you want to use this variable and display it below your page, make sure you use PHP, okay, to recognize your PHP, okay, okay, something like that. But of course, when you create this one, and if you want to display it at the top, it would be impossible because you are not yet creating value to it. So that's the good thing about PHP. Whenever you want to use it, just put them anywhere on your page, something like that, and then echo. You can reuse them as many times as you want. Even uh, even reuse the variable and assign different type to it. It's uh, easier to integrate that in PHP. While in other languages, it's really impossible to declare the variable and use other type once you declare them. Okay, so anyway, let me continue. Okay, what are the other data types that you can use in PHP? We have strings. Okay, strings is very common. Integer or floating point with decimal point. I already have an example to it in our module. So please learn the concept because I'm just showing you the shortcut of the discussion. So Boolean are true or false. What are Booleans? So, and by the way, let me emphasize the discussion of string so that we can have idea. Okay. So let me show some example. Okay, strings. So let's focus on strings. Okay. Okay, let me remove this one. Okay, strings. Okay. Okay, string is like an array of characters. So what are some ways that we can use string? We have several functions of strings. Let's say for example, we have a variable. Let's say str name John do something like that. Let's say for example, we want to display the size of the string. So str len to determine the length of the string. Str name. Do not forget the dollar sign, which means I'm going to display the size of the string. So let us render them. Okay, so I have 8. By the way, undefined variable because I just echo the variable without value. So unrecognized siya. So let's remove that. Unless I provide a variable with a value. So by the way, unlike other programming languages, PHP tries to execute line by line. So as you can see, it successfully executed the previous lines, but when it encounters error, it will stop on that particular line. Okay, but in other programming languages, it will not execute the entire program. Okay, another is concatenation. What is concatenation? Concatenation means you try to merge two different value of string or data into one line. So how do we do that? Let's say, for example, let's say str name. You use period or dot. Okay, as size of that, something like that. Meaning, we try to display these lines into, or these three different data into one line. That is what we call concatenation. You use the dot. Okay, I suggest to put spaces so that we can recognize. Kasi when we tackle objects kasi has ano has, let's say for example, class dot get name, something like that. To distinguish between object and ordinary concatenation, I suggest you use period with space. And of course, to separate this line from this line, you need to use a space inside your string. So let's try to display. Okay, so as you can see, I have now a single line containing the name of the contents of the variable name, and my string has size of, and the value or the count, the result of the function is tr length. Okay? So I guess it's clear. Okay. There are also additional, let's say for example, word count. Let's try str. You can also count how many words are there in a string. Let's say for example, str word. So this is what I really like about IDEs. It has intelligence. So no more. Okay, so it has two words. Yeah, just like this one. So, by the way, you can search for this in the online PHP documentation on php.net to know more about some important concept of the PHP language. So this is so we have version PHP 8. So documentation, go to the documentation part and syempre in English. You can also download the documentation online or for offline reading. So installation, basic syntax, variables, etc. So you can, you know, you can browse. Some of you might be making a shortcut, not reading the documentation, but I suggest to read the documentation properly. Okay, so as you can see, in this particular example, it actually merges. Okay, but of course, you use echo double quotes to display the contents of the variable. Okay, so please read the documentation. Okay, okay. So let us continue. How about numeric? Uh, numeric type of data. So this is simple as writing integers. So we have integer, we have float. Okay. So the difference between integer and floats, in floats, floating point has decimal point. So if you want to convert, by the way, let's say for example, assuming this is string, something like that, and you want to convert that to numeric, let's say num, all you have to do is you can convert that. We call that casting. When you say casting, converting from type to another type. For example, if we want to convert this into integer, you write int, just like what we do in C++. So str name, something like that. Okay, so it's what you call casting. The contents, as long as the value of the variable contains numeric only, but if it is a string, let's say for example f 1 2 3 4, let's see what will happen. Okay, echo natin siya. Echo num, something like that. Okay. Okay, as you can see, it automatically ignores the value of the string variable because it contains mixed type of data, numeric and non-numeric. So it will be automatically ignored and converted to zero. Okay, so that's what you call casting. Okay, and let's try to identify the type. Okay, type, something like that. Sorry, I forgot the P. Okay, so let's remove this one. Let's see what data type the PHP chosen for that value. So integers. Let's try to add that 3, 4, 5, 6, something like that. So let's try. Oops. Int pala siya. Sorry. Int. Let's see float. Okay. Okay, float na siya. But what if we don't cast? Let's see if what happened. So as you can see, if we don't cast the contents of a string, and if you want to convert that to numeric and you don't apply casting, it will automatically converted or still converted to string. Okay, so if you have value coming from text box, from the form, you need to uh, cast, or as long as it doesn't have quotation mark or double quotation, PHP will always interpret that to numeric. Okay. Okay. How about operators? So you can use uh, operators, arithmetic. We call that uh, addition, subtraction. So in PHP, we have addition, subtraction, division, the modulus. Okay, let me identify. So addition, let me just type na lang. Ano po, hindi na kasi kasama sa slide to. Addition, subtraction, division, oops, division. Multiplication is asterisk. And you can also use exponent by putting two multiplication symbol. So this means if you write, let's say for example, if you want to write 2 raised to 2, something like this in mathematics, like in algebra, something like that, you must write this as, let's say, 2 double multiplication 2, something like that. So this would be what we call exponent. Okay? So yeah, so that's how you write exponent. Okay? So yeah. Precedence. When you see precedence, that is the order in which our programming language interpret any expression. So, by the way, left to right, multiplication, division are the same level, subtraction, followed by subtraction and addition. Of course, the highest priority depends upon your formula. If you use parentheses, so it will be interpreted first. Okay, just like what we used to do in other programming languages. Okay, comparison operator. We have the equal, not equal. Okay, so we have equal. This is for equal. We have okay. We have identical. What is the difference between equal and identical? When we say equal, the value are for both variables, they are equal. For example, if we have, let's say, x equals to 10, and of course y equals to 10, when you use equal, let's say comment out this one. Okay. If you use equal, you simply did evaluate if the value of x and y are equal, something like that. That's literal. So it returns true or false. Okay, so let's write. So meaning true, 1. Okay. Now, what's the difference between identical? Identical means you try to evaluate if the value of x and y are equal and they are the same type. Are they the same type? Something like that. For example, 0. Okay, so this one is floating point and this one is integer. Let's see what will happen. Okay. Okay, so 0 siya. So let's try to integrate this one. If let's say echo true, something like that. Else echo false. Okay. Okay, so let's try. Okay, so false. So meaning they are not identical, although they might have the same value, but they are not totally identical because this one is floating point and this one is integer. So that's the difference. Not equal means if they are not equal. Okay, or you can use this one, something like that. Okay, so that's not equal. Okay, greater than equal. So that's very common. Okay. Okay, another is operation is, let's say for example we have x equals to 10. Okay. Now, by the way, I suggest before I forgot, when you write HTML, PHP together, it's really a mix of languages, and it's really important that you need to apply indentation. Okay? You are not writing news from a newspaper to make it left aligned. So when you write code, make sure you use proper spacing so that it will become readable and easy to maintain. Okay? Some of you might not use it, or some of you might not observing the spacing and indentation, but I strongly suggest to use proper indentation. Okay? Now, let's echo, let's say, we call that pre-increment. So what is the difference between x plus plus and plus plus x? Okay, sige nga, kayo naman na magsalita. Okay, sino ang pwedeng sumagot? What is the difference between x plus plus, let's put some uh, break tag here so that we can have separate output break tag. Okay, who can answer the question? What is the difference between a pre-increment and a post-increment? Sino ang makakasagot? Sige, tawag tayo ng force volunteer. So, I'm going to call okay, hello? Walang sasagot? Okay, hanap tayo sa mga participants. Okay. How about Mona Lisa? Can you give us the difference between post-increment and pre-increment? Mona Lisa, are you there? Hello? 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 Wala.
Alas 9 man lang ano ta sa ano na sa Monday.
Ang rin po, sir.
Ang defense.
Ako po.
Okay na?
How about? Ayaw eh.
Okay na.
Gian, can you give us the difference? Kahit ano lang, hint lang. Do your best. Gian,
Opo, sir.
ano ang pagkakaiba ng
Sir.
x plus plus sa plus plus x?
On pre-increment, sir, before assigning the value to the variable, pag post-increment,
Okay. So, alimbawa, if we try to
an
display,
operator is gagamit sa pag
yes,
sa variable after parang
okay, para maintindihan nila, pag ito na-execute ang line na to sa line 10, anong magiging laman ng x? Is it 10 or 11?
Feeling ko sir 11 yun sir. Kasi,
11. 11
pre,
daw. So, ay assume sabi, sabi nung isa, si Alan ba yun? Sabi ni Alan, 11 daw. Okay, ikaw, how about you, Gian, Fulgar? 11 din ba sagot mo? Sabi ni Kenneth, 12. Huwag niyo munang itry to sa computer, ah. Okay. How about plus plus x? Ano magiging laman ng X after? I-comment ko muna to para later natin ma-test. So, tingin nyo, pag nag-plus plus ako, X plus X ako, ano magiging laman ni X? Pag na-execute tong line na to, 11 or 10?
That is for what?
Glyza, sa tingin mo, ano magiging laman ni ano? Ano magiging laman ng X mo pagka in-execute mo siya? Is it 10 or 11?
Okay, we need to check that. No. To check that, let us check first.
11 daw sabi ni Hamila. Okay, 11. Okay, so let's try. Okay, let me give you the thank you very much for participating. Okay, ibig sabihin nitong pre-increment, magkakaroon lang siya ng plus 1 kasi pareha siya nagpa-plus 1. Magkakaroon lang siya na pag post-increment magkakaroon lang siya ng plus 1 after siya ma-execute. Ibig sabihin, ang laman pa rin ito ay 10. Let's see ha. Na-echo ko ba yun? Okay, 10 pa rin po siya. I-display pa rin natin ulit. Echo X. Okay? Kaya marami nagkakaroon ng error dito. Ngayon, nirun natin to 10. I-run uli natin siya for another time. Okay. Notice what will happen. See, 11 na siya after. Kasi nga, post-increment. Post-increments mean after. Mag-add siya ng isa after ma-execute. Yun ang difference ng pre-increment saka post-increment. Kasi ang pre-increment, nag-add na siya ng isa upon execution. Okay, comment natin to So kanina, nung in-execute natin tong line na x++, 10 pa rin siya. Try natin sa echo plus x. See, 11 na siya. So, careful of using increment and post-increment. The same with decrement, minus, something like that. Okay po? Clear? Clear na ano? Okay. Okay.
Clear po.
You can also integrate concatenation using this one. Let's say, for example, let's say, word, let's say, hello, something like that. Okay. So, yung operations na yon like equal, pwede nating magamit. For example, word period equal, meaning, nag-concatenate ka from the same word, dinagdagan mo siya ng another word. Okay? Just like what we do in C#, ano po, parang plus, equal, something like that. So, you can also integrate that. So, meaning, you concatenate this hello to another word, world, something like that. So, yeah, append, parang appending. We call that appending. So, it's like plus, equal, meaning append, na dadagdagan. Okay? Okay. So, yun. Okay? So, question so far?
First, C3.
Okay. So, I guess, wala na, no? Okay. Boolean. Boolean, na-try na natin itong Boolean kanina. So, let's say, for example, Boolean is only true or false. Let's say, bool. Dina-type pala siya, keyword. Is male. Something like that. Equals true. Something like that. So, that is Boolean. Echo is male. Okay. Okay. True siya. Kasi 1. On, off. Diba? Pag true, 1. Pag 0, false. Okay. Ganun siya. Ano po? That's Boolean. How about another type? Ano ba yung another type natin? Array. So, array means, itong medyo, siguro ang iba confusing dito. Okay. Array means, you can, unlike any ordinary variable, like x, something like that. This is an ordinary variable that when you create variable, you can only assign one value. But when you use array, you can actually assign multiple value to it. Meaning, in one variable, you can create multiple data. Ano po? So, magkakaroon tayo ng separate discussion ito in different topic. So, pero ngayon discuss ko muna ng pahapyaw. Ano po? So, for example, I want to display fruits, something like that. Okay. So, in order to create an array, you need to create first a variable, okay, followed by equal sign and keyword array. Meaning, you are trying to create an array. Let's say banana, followed by the way, I'm using string, ano po? Banana, grapes, let's say apple. Apple. Okay. Something like that. So, how do we display, let's say, echo tayo. Echo, bardam, fruits. Okay, something like that. Okay, now, let's try to display that into our browser. Okay, I have now array of 3 elements. When you say 3 elements, 3 values yan. So, I have string banana, string grapes, string apple. In an element of an array, may tinatawag tayong index. Ito yun. Ano po? So, let me copy this one. Let's screenshot na lang natin. Okay. 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 Ganito. This one is what you call lang Okay. So this one is what you call elements. Laki pala. Laki ng element. Okay, this is what you call element. Element. Ibig sabihin, ilang data meron ang array mo. Ano po? This one is what you call index. Ibig sabihin, ito yung address ng mga data sa array mo. So, we have index 0, si banana yon. So, ibig sabihin, when you call the array name, let's say array name, and you write a bracket plus index, you are trying to display this element. Kasi this one is 0, this one is 1, and this one is 2. So we have equals to 3 elements. So 1, 2, 3. So nag-i-start lang yung counting natin sa 0. Okay? So parang index minus 1. Okay? So that's what you call an array. Okay po? Clear? So for example, if you want to display them, or if you want to display array, so fruits, okay, you need to use this bracket, then 0, or index. Make sure, alam natin kung ano yung index na tinatawag mo. Okay, you need to identify which index you are trying to call. Kasi when you try to call index that is not part of that array, let's say 5, what will happen is out of bound. Diba? Undefined offset siya. Kasi wala namang, or there's no index number 5. Okay? So, yun. Okay, that's data type array. How about object? Objects are used for OOP or classes. Okay. Sorry. OOP. OOP. Object-oriented programming. Okay. Like, anyway, magkakaroon tayo ng separate niya. Null, resource. Resource naman, usually, ginagamit natin to for ginagamit natin to pag mga files, etc. Yun yung common niya. Hindi siya actual data type, but we store reference to function to external PHP. Okay? Common example niya is yung pag-call ng database. That is resource. Let's say for example, gumamit tayo ng let's say for example, connection. we use connection, kinol natin yung MySQL database. So, kinol natin siya, i-connect. So, yun yung magiging resource niya. Okay? So, yun. Okay? So, yun. Now, in previous activities, we have demonstrated some examples like operators and variables. So, do you have any more questions? By the way, is it okay to have our classes weekly online meeting? Okay lang ba sa inyo? Okay lang ba? Kaya ba ng budget?
Yes po, sir.
Kasi medyo ano na eh, medyo ano na tayo sa oras, gawl na tayo sa oras kasi ang hindi siya ano eh, hindi siya katulad ng regular semester na 6 months. Meron lang tayong 2 months to 3 months, ganun lang. So para ma-fast track natin. So next meeting, pag-usapan natin yung ano, pag-usapan natin yung other, yung looping, yung conditional. Sunod naman, pag-usapan na natin yung database. So, the next 3 meetings are very important because the next meeting forms tayo, pag-usapan natin later yung form. Pag-usapan natin next meeting yung paggamit ng mga loops, conditional, sunod naman paggamit ng database, sunod naman yung pag-integrate na ng tinatawag na CRUD or create, update, delete ng mga data sa database. And so on. Okay? So, make sure present kayo parate. Okay. Now, in our previous activity, meron tayong ginawa doon. Gumamit tayo ng form, di ba? By the way, as you notice, if your program doesn't require any PHP script, you don't need to save the file into PHP. It's okay to save it into HTML. For example, we need to create data. For example, form.html. Okay lang yun. Kasi nga, hindi naman nangangailangan to ng PHP. Unlike yung first page natin na may PHP syntax, required tayo to use that PHP extension. So let's try. So how do we transfer data to another document? Unlike C#, in C# kasi it's easy to transfer data from one form to another form kasi nga they are bound to one project. But in PHP or in web application, we have individual pages that are not connected. So how do we transfer data to another data? There are actually two ways. The first one is to use form. So let's say for example, in our form, gamit tayo ng form. Okay? So, gawa tayo ng input. So input, so type. Okay. I already mentioned this into our module, mga type text. Para makabibig tayo ng text. Okay. And another, gawa tayo ng submit button. Type submit. Okay, something like that. Okay. So we need to add a value to it so that we can provide caption. Okay, something like that. Okay, so now I have a form. So let's try to run this into our browser. Okay. Tanggalin natin siya. Okay. Now I have this form. Ayan. So if I try to input something there, we need to submit that and display that to another page or submit or just get the contents of this text box. In order to do that, you need to make this form. So a form is like an element in your HTML that allows you to add text boxes and other controls and submit that to other document. So, what are the requirements? Number one is the method. When we say method, how do you want to transfer that into that particular form? So we particular document. We have get and post. What is the difference between get and post? Get is your data is not encrypted. So let's try to use get first muna. Okay. Another properties of a form is action. Saan location mo siya i-transfer with is action, you need to provide location of the file where your data need to be transferred. Let's say for example, process dot PHP, something like that. Okay, so meaning when you add data to this text box, once the button submit is clicked, the data of this text box will be transferred to this file. Okay, so let's create another file, process.php, something like that. So we need to add also the HTML for proper uh, okay document. Okay, so now let's go back to this. Now, in order to transfer the data from this and get the data from this text box, you need to add a name to it. Name, so that we can easily identify. Let's say txt data, something like that. Okay, so get. So in the process.php, so again, PHP can be embedded in your document, in any part of your document. So I will be embedding my PHP in the body tag. So PHP. Okay. Okay. Now, okay. So how do I get the value from this text box and display in here? So in order to do that, we need to use server variable. So we need to create a variable first. Let's say my data. Let's say echo na lang muna tayo. Echo. We need to use the server variable called get. Something like that. Since the method that we use in our form is get, the server variable that we are going to use is get method also. And inside this bracket, we need to identify what particular name of the control our data came from. In this example, we use txt data. So we need to integrate, or we need to name include that name inside our get, the name of the text box, something like that. Okay, so let's write. Okay, so we will try to refresh this one. Enter. Let's say hello, something like that. Submit. So as you notice, nandiyan na siya. So view natin. Ayan. So there's no PHP code here. Instead, what we rin. By the way, I have this error because I have used variable that is not recognized. Okay. 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 Now,
Ilang kong karawat-awat, sabihin dito na dapat before it, ito na sila lahat. Para pagkapag test ka, hindi naman para sikot-sikot. Diretso na ang kasi meron
okay, so let's display. Ay, ayan na siya, 'di ba? So it's good thing. Let's try another. Okay. 12. Okay, so okay na. Now, I'm going to change the display of my screen. Let me focus on the upper right portion of my screen. Nakikita po ba to? Address bar. Nakikita po ba?
Opo, sir.
Oh, mapapansin nyo, pag get, nandyan sa taas. Di ba? Nandyan sa taas. That's the reason why get is seldomly used in transferring data kasi hindi siya encrypted. Nakikita siya. Assuming, kunwari password siya, di ba? Ano, gawin natin siyang password. Let's say type, password. Password. Kunwari, password siya sa form. So, pinapa-input mo ng password yung user. And, syempre, ginawa mo sa form mo, ganito. Password ngayon, ano? Hello. Ang problema, if you use get, makikita natin yung laman ng text box, hello. Okay? So, may mga certain particular use lang ang get na advisable siya. Meron namang hindi siya pwedeng gamitin. Just like this one. If you need your data to be encrypted, transferring to another document, you need to use post instead of get. Okay? So let's try that one. So instead of get, change this to post. Let's see what will happen. Of course, when you use post, you can also need to change this one into post. Something like that. Okay? Now, let us go back to our form, refresh, and type something. Let's modify this one. So let's go back to text. Okay? Then refresh natin ulit. Okay, reload. Let's say 12. Now, as you can see, it actually displayed the value. But notice the address bar section. It will no longer display the variable or the name of the text box and its value, corresponding value. So it's now encrypted. Okay? So that's the difference between post. Okay? Now, sometimes it's a good practice that instead of using get or post, you can use request. Something like this. Request. Request. It addresses both. It's either use get or post, you can use request. It's the same. Okay. So it actually works pa rin. Something like that. Present. So, yeah. So sometimes I use this one so that I will not be confused about what did I use in my form. Is it get or post? So instead of thinking of which server variable to use, I just use request. Okay? So, yun. Now, that's how you transfer data. That's the first method. Another method is to use link, of course. Let's say it's ref, let's say uh, process dot php. This time you need to enclose this one, a question mark and the variable name. A variable name plus value, something like that. Okay, so let's say process me, something like that. Okay, now let's go back to our page. So in this way, you're actually mimicking the get method, but instead you write the address and with corresponding variable and value, something like that. Okay, so let's write. Okay, let's double check. Okay, so as you can see, I have process me. When you click this one, let's say undefined. Undefined siya because I'm using this one. So let me comment out this one. Let me replace it with echo and request. You can also use get. You can only use get for links. So instead, what particular parameter do I need to type here? The name of the variable that is being addressed to that particular link. Something like that. Okay. Okay, so let's press. Okay, nandiyan na siya. Okay. So that's how you transfer data. It's either use link or you use a form. Okay. If you can still remember, there are several websites. Let's say, for example, let's look for an example website. Let's say uh, Google. Let's say Google. Some of you might notice this one. Let's say uh, PHP OOP, something like that. So as you notice, let's see, let's confirm this one. Okay, traffic lights. Naku, may confirmation pa. Okay, so as you notice, at the address portion of your browser, it has search, and this one, as you notice, this one is a variable. So if you try to change this one into another, let's say for example Q, let's say hi, the criteria for search will be changed also. That's how Google searches your term. It uses the get method instead of post. Okay? So that it can identify what criteria you inputted into your search box, something like that. So other things are basically requirements for Google to search terms, something like that. But the most important here is the transfer of data is being made by post, get method, or by form. Okay? Clear? Clear? Okay. So I guess okay na. I guess okay na, clear na. Okay, so I will be uh,